ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to welcome you at the annual Georg Forster Lecture of SOCUM, the Research Center for Social and Cultural Studies in Mainz. It's a great pleasure for me to, indeed it's an honor to us all, I think, to welcome Fredric Jameson from Duke University at this occasion in Mainz. Before I'm trying to engage in the impossible task to introduce Fredric Jameson to you in only 5 minutes, let me sketch very briefly what SOCUM is about. This research center promotes transdisciplinary research cooperation between social and cultural sciences and Mainz University. It aims to exploit the considerable potential for innovation that ensues from a sustained network between scholars from social and cultural sciences. They share, so we think, central research objects, but they diverge in their theoretical vocabularies, in their language games, and in their methodological approaches. SOCUM collects researchers from numerous disciplines to cross these boundaries by building transdisciplinary working groups with the goal to develop them into third-party funded research collaborations. Currently, the center holds 4 working groups called Undoing Differences, the Public Constitution of Minorities, Indigenous Studies, and Discourse, Power, Knowledge. In addition, SOCUM supervises a group of PhD students, organizes workshops and international conferences, and once a year it invites internationally widely recognized researchers to hold the Georg Forster Lecture. This lecture is named after the anthropologist and natural scientist Johann Georg Adam Forster, who in the 18th century participated in James Cook's second circumnavigation of the Earth. Since he was a stout Republican, activist, and served as director of the University Library of Mainz, he is one of our local heroes. Against this background, it is, as you will realize, by no means accidentally that we asked Fredric Jameson to give this year's lecture. He is professor of comparative literature and of Romance studies at Duke University. After graduating in the 1950s, he traveled to Europe, studying at Aix-en-Provence, Munich, and Berlin. Back in the US, he pursued his dissertation on Jean-Paul Sartre at Yale University. After his PhD in 1959, he has taught at Harvard University, Yale, and the University of California in San Diego and in Santa Cruz, before finding a home in Duke in 1985. The academic world in which Fredric Jameson trained routinely segregated aesthetics from politics and economics, like our universities separate cultural sciences and social sciences. In contrast, Jameson's guiding premise is that cultural artifacts are oblique representations of the historical circumstances of their creation and reception. So they are rooted in political and economic conditions. Of the last 5 decades, Fredric Jameson has published over 20 books and many dozens of articles. Let me just remind you of 4 of his most prominent book titles. 10 years after his dissertation on Sartre, his second book, Marxism and Form, was a pioneering account of Western Marxism's major thinkers, from Georg Lukács and Ernst Bloch through the central figures of the Frankfurt School. Not only were most English language readers largely unfamiliar with these writers when the book first appeared, but their mood of dialectical, acutely self-reflective thinking was also the very antithesis of the empiricism and logical positivism that had dominated and still dominates universities in the Anglo-Saxon world. 1972, in The Prison House of Language, Jameson critiques Marxism's principal rivals, that is, the various anti-historical formalisms that set the tone of the humanities since the 1950s, including Claude Lévi-Strauss' structuralism and Roland Barthes' semiotics. This book initiated a decades-long analysis and critique of hermeneutics and structuralist theories of language and literature that would importantly inform later debates on post-structuralism. In the 80s, history came to play an increasingly central role in Jameson's interpretation of both the reading and writing of literary texts. His book from 1981, The Political Unconscious, Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, opened with a famous slogan, always historicize. The book's argument emphasizes history as the ultimate horizon of literary and cultural analysis. Artistic choices that were ordinarily viewed in purely aesthetic terms were recast in terms of historical literary practices and norms. Jameson's book claimed to establish Marxian literary criticism as the most all-inclusive and comprehensive theoretical framework for understanding literature. The publication of this book, I think, rendered Jameson the leading Marxist literary critic in America. Again, 10 years later, in 1991, Jameson published Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. The title pronounced the message. Postmodernist art, architecture, and film are the cultural representation of multinational finance capitalism. Jameson explains the postmodern skepticism towards meta-narratives as a mood of experience stemming from the conditions of intellectual labor imposed by the late capitalist mood of production. The book charts the stylistic and ideological movement in arts from 19th century realism and early 20th century modernism into postmodernism, a sequence Jameson parallels with the capitalism's successive mutations from mercantilism and industrialism into its later monopoly and nowadays global or speculative stages. Realism and modernism flourished during historical periods when the economic, political, and cultural realms remained partly autonomous, but beginning in the mid-20th century and crystallizing in the early 70s, the global marketplace and speculative finance led modernity's divisions among social spheres collapse. The cultural becomes economic, and the economic and political are turned into so many forms of culture. In his view, postmodernity's merging of all discourse into an undifferentiated whole was the result of the polarization of the cultural sphere. Jameson's later writings include Archaeologies of the Future, that's a study of utopia and science fiction, 2005, Postmodernism, A Single Modernity. Both books form part of a larger project entitled The Poetics of Social Form, which still follows his agenda, I quote Jameson, to provide a general history of aesthetic forms, at the same time seeking to show how this history can read in tandem with the history of social and economic formations. Diving into the work of Fredric Jameson, one is confronted with a dizzying range of resources. Side by side you find Adorno's negative dialectics, popular American movies, suppressed Soviet novels, exotic Philippine films, Hegel's philosophy, modern architecture, music, and literature. His works have been widely translated and notably influential in China, and he has received many, many fellowships and awards. I only mentioned two of them. In 2008, Fredric Jameson was awarded the Norwegian Holberg International Memorial Prize in recognition of his career-long research on the relation between social formation and cultural forms. In January this year, the Modern Language Association gave him their award for lifetime scholarly achievement. Fredric Jameson, we are glad and we are proud to have you here at SOCOM's fourth Georg Forster lecture. We are very much looking forward to your talk, The Aesthetics of Singularity, Time and Event in Postmodernity.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm very honored to be here in the former Republic of Mainz and giving this prestigious lecture. I'm doubly embarrassed, however, one, to have to sit like this, and two, not to do this in German out of sheer laziness, I'm afraid. Adjust it here. And if you don't, can you hear me all right in the back? Is it all right? Because we weren't certain. Water. All right, I want to say a little more today about the theory of postmodernity and perhaps augment it in some new and unfamiliar ways. In the direction of finance capital, for example, and in that of politics and globalization. But I also don't want to try your patience too much, and I'll try to keep this to an hour and leave out what has to be left out. But first, I need to correct some misconceptions, which can be clarified by disentangling postmodernity itself from postmodernism. The latter is essentially adjectival, as you can see, and it mainly characterizes aesthetic production when not philosophy itself. This is the sense in which people say that postmodernism is over and done with, that we now have neoconceptualism or some other style of fashion. But on my view, postmodernity is a historical and a periodizing concept, one way of naming the third stage of capitalism, or the age of globalization, or the era of finance capital, and so on and so forth. I think that people began to become aware that we were entering a new historical moment around 1980. But I also think you'll agree that used in this periodizing fashion, it wouldn't make much sense to argue that postmodernity is passé, unless by that you meant we were entering a whole new stage of history, a whole new historical epoch, which I think we haven't begun to do yet. So while it seems to me perfectly proper to talk about postmodern architecture or the postmodern novel, and to theorize those forms, as we'll do in a somewhat different way in a moment, I think they have to be grasped as symptoms of that transformation which is postmodernity as a whole. We might say expressions of its structure, but after all, symptoms are also expressions. And the diagnostic word perhaps better captures the dimension of the unconscious at work here, the dimension of the artistic phenomenon which demands decipherment and interpretation. Meanwhile, but this will not be a completely aesthetic talk, as my title may have led you to believe. Meanwhile, the postmodern has also frequently been understood as a way of thinking or even a kind of philosophy, and I think there are thinkers out there who actually call themselves postmodern philosophers and who characterize what they do as postmodern philosophy. And I suppose I have no objection to that. And as far as the tenets of this new kind of philosophy are concerned, I assume they include anti-foundationalism, anti-essentialism, and the proposition that truth is not a representational matter, something often stigmatized by older-fashioned philosophers and other enemies of the postmodern as relativism. Terrible thing. Add constructivism to all that, and I don't mind endorsing it myself, but I have to add that as far as I'm concerned, philosophy itself is a symptom of postmodernity, like art, and that postmodern philosophy is not a new kind of truth, but rather simply an expression and a symptom of that whole new system and structure which I've been calling postmodernity as such. So what I propose to do here tonight is then to examine in turn various kinds of symptoms or expressions of postmodernity in the realms of the aesthetic and of taste, in that of economics, in that of concepts and of social phenomenology, and finally in that of politics, if we get that far. But my remarks about philosophy will also make it clear why I think that the claims of all its subfields are equally null and void. Marxism and psychoanalysis are not philosophies, but rather something else. But political philosophy, or what passes for it, is as dead as a doornail, and so is aesthetics, and as for ethics as such, non parlons pas. It is at any rate with aesthetics that we begin, because I think it'll clarify this title and make it a little more clearer why I thought it useful and suggestive to range so many other topics, the economic, the social, the political, under this ostensibly aesthetic rubric. And with that, we may proceed to this disreputable thing which is aesthetics, or the science of beauty. and to those peculiar kinds of art produced today which are so different from the various traditional kinds that one sometimes wonders whether it's worth using the same word for all of them, and that would be yet another reason for abandoning aesthetics as such. Now, many distinguished art critics have evoked the volatilization of the art object in recent times, and I'll simply presuppose all those discussions by taking as my principal example or exhibit of contemporary art the installation as such. We don't do easel paintings anymore or statues, but we do often come upon these spatial exhibits in which various disparate and unrelated kinds of objects are somehow juxtaposed. Say, a heap of painted pebbles, a framed picture on the wall, maybe a rusty lawnmower and a dead bird, a sample of graffiti, and an antique armchair or sofa. None of these objects is the objet d'art itself, so if this collection is a work, then its logic lies in their interrelationality. But where is that relationship? In space, to be sure. This is a spatial art. But is it in our minds and our purely private associations? Paintings often have style and bear the mark of a subjectivity, but the arrangement of the installation is utterly impersonal, and in that sense styleless, even though presumably it corresponds to someone's choices, although it's not itself an idea or a theme or a statement. We can draw a few initial conclusions from these first observations. First of all, clearly enough, the installation marks a significant disintegration of the old classical system of the fine arts système des beaux-arts, if not its complete restructuration. In a movement characteristic of the postmodern, the arts, which in modernity developed in a regime of differentiation, each art tending towards a kind of autonomy or semi-autonomy in its own right, the arts now in the postmodern reverse that direction and conflate, falling back on one another in new and unexpected symbioses. So it is that photography, once a poor cousin of painting, has become a major art in postmodernity, but has also known all kinds of hybridizations and graftings with the other arts. This would be something of the equivalent of the supersession of fiction by nonfiction in literature, and it's of course an unsurprising development in the society of the spectacle, where we're already bombarded by thousands of images a day in real life. But it should also be remembered that photography is an abstraction of the visual and the tactile and the bodily. This matter of postmodern abstraction will be crucial, as you'll see. Meanwhile, the hybridization of the arts gives us yet another reason why the search for some unique density and perfection in any given art is no longer a viable ambition. Two more developments need to be mentioned at this point. If the individual arts no longer have any telos or momentum of their own as they did in the modern, then it also becomes somewhat more comprehensible why the avant-gardes should have ceased to exist today. Clearly, this vanishing of the avant-gardes as such, perhaps Cobra and situationism were the last of the species, has other determinants as well, and in particular, the weakening of collective structures and the crisis of politics. I mean of party politics, insofar as the vanguard party had a fundamental relationship to the vanguard artistic movements and vice versa. But has anything taken the place of the avant-garde on the current scene? I believe that here again the installation gives us a clue. For does this assemblage of heterogeneous objects and items in a momentary constellation not have its macro equivalent in the very contemporary museum itself, with its heteroclite shows and its ingeniously themed and equally ephemeral exhibitions? The conclusion is inescapable. The collective avant-garde has in our time and in postmodernity been replaced by the single figure of the curator, who now becomes the demiurge of these floating and dissolving constellations of strange objects we still call art. in that case, maybe we don't have great artists any longer, we have great curators. And maybe we need to look more closely at this novel and creative figure today, whose structural position may be expected to have an equivalent in other realms of the information society, such as medicine or the university, business administration, and government itself. Our political leaders are all curators, if that. Sometimes bad curators. If for Adorno, the virtuoso conductor was the very image of the emergent dictator in 19th century bourgeois politics, he was thinking of Napoleon III, what may not the curatorial role have to tell us about our own systems of power? But since I seemed to disparage philosophy a moment ago, I probably have some kind of moral obligation to suggest that what's replaced philosophy in our own time, namely theory, is also perhaps a kind of curatorial practice, selecting name bits from our various theoretical or philosophical sources and putting them all together in a kind of conceptual installation in which we marvel at the new intellectual relations thereby momentarily produced. Deleuze is a figure of that kind. Very exciting figure. But there's a nastier side of the curator yet to be mentioned, and that can easily be grasped if we look at installations again, and indeed entire exhibits in the newer postmodern museums, as having their distant and more primitive ancestors, perhaps, in the happenings of the 60s. Artistic phenomena equally spatial, equally devoid of personal style, equally non-objective, equally ephemeral and relational. The difference lies not only in the absence of humans from the installation, and indeed, save for the curator, from the newer museums as such, it lies in the very presence of the institution itself. Everything in contemporary art is subsumed under it. Indeed, the curator may be said to be something like its allegorical embodiment or personification. In postmodernity, we no longer exist in a world of a human scale. Institutions have in some sense become autonomous, but certainly in another they transcend the dimensions of any individual, whether master or servant, something that can also be grasped by reminding ourselves of the dimension of globalization in which institutions today exist, the museum very much included. But these institutions are no longer to be conceived along the lines of the machines or the factory, or in terms of what used to be called the state. Communications technology requires us to think of them as informational institutions, perhaps, or immense cyberspace constructions. Yet the reminder of the happenings also suggests yet another characteristic of the newer art, and of the installation in particular, and also explains why these newer works, if we can still call them that, are at any rate no longer objects, whatever else they may be. But now we can see a little better what they really are. They're not objects because they are in fact events. The installation and its kindred production are made not for posterity, nor even for the permanent collection, but rather for the now, and for a temporality which may be rather different from the old modernist kind. This is indeed why it's become appropriate to speak of it not as a work or a style, not even as the expression of something, but rather as a strategy, or maybe a strategy for producing an event, a recipe for events. And jumping ahead to politics for a second, can we not see the great mass demonstrations? I think in texting they're called flash crowds, flash mobs. The equivalent of just such events, rather different from the old-fashioned revolutionary conspiracies. Symptoms of a different temporality, rather than signs of the emergence of something like the people, or even direct democracy, I think. One final observation before we try to say what kind of event these postmodern artistic happenings might be. I mentioned technology a while back. Did I add that in our postmodern age, we not only use technology, we consume it. and we consume its exchange value along with the rest of its more symbolic essence. Just as in an older period, the automobile was consumed as much for its libidinal value and its symbolic overtones as for its practical use value, so today, but in a far more complex way, the computer and the internet and their ramifications, already well integrated into utopian political fantasies, have replaced an older artistic and cultural consumption, which they have both modified and supplanted. We now consume the very form of communication along with its content. But this distinction between form and content now brings me at least to the essentials of what I wanted to observe about art today in what's not only a postmodern but also a theoretical age. The great Polish science fiction writer Stanisław Lem once wrote a series of book reviews of imaginary books, books from the future which neither he nor anyone else would ever write. It was a prophetic gesture because it demonstrated that you could consume the idea of a book with as much satisfaction as the real book itself. How then to characterize the spirit of the newer works? I want to go back to that older category of art criticism which invoked the inspiration, the Einfall, the idea for a work, and to adapt it to this newer production for which the idea is a kind of technical discovery, or perhaps an invention in the sense of the contraptions of the lonely crackpot inventors or obsessives. Art today is generated by a single bright idea which, combining form and content, can be repeated ad infinitum until the artist's name takes on a kind of content of its own. Thus, the Chinese artist Xu Bing conceived the idea of making up conjunctures of lines or strokes that looked like real Chinese characters, but were utterly without meaning. We might think of nonsense words or even Zaum or Klebnikov's made-up language, yet these Western phenomena really have no equivalent for the visual dimension of the Chinese system. This was thus a remarkable conception, or Einfall, a discovery of genius, if you like, provided it's understood that it constitutes neither a formal innovation, nor the elaboration of a style, nor is it autoreferential in the modernist sense, or even aesthetic in the sense of altering or estranging perception or intensifying it. The question that interests me is whether we can call this art conceptual in a now older and henceforth more traditional sense. Because I understand the older conceptual art as the production of physical objects, let's say a set of stones, which flex mental categories by pitting them against each other, as maybe like Hegel's determinations of reflection in the logic. But these categories, whether we can express them or not, are somehow universal forms in the older conceptual art, are somehow universal forms like Kant's categories or Hegel's moments. And conceptual objects are therefore a little like antinomies or paradoxes or Zen koan in the verbal philosophical realm, occasions for a strange kind of meditative practice. But postmodern neoconceptualism is not at all like this. With Xu Bing and the rest of a postmodern artistic production for which I take him to be paradigmatic, it seems to me that the situation is wholly different. His texts are, as it were, soaked in theory. They are as theoretical as they are visual, but they don't illustrate an idea, nor do they offer material for a meditation or a mental or conceptual exercise. A concept is there, but it's singular. And this conceptual art is nominalistic rather than universal. When we look at works of this kind, we're engaged in a theoretical process. That is, what we consume is no longer a purely visual or material entity, but rather the idea of such an entity. What the artists now create is not the work in whatever older or newer sense. Today we consume the idea of the work, as in Lem's imaginary book reviews. And the work itself, if we can still call it that, is a mixture of theory and singularity. It's not material. We consume it as an idea rather than a sensory presence. And it's not subject to aesthetic universalism either, insofar as each of these artifacts reinvents the very idea of art itself in a new and non-universalizable form, so that it is in that sense even doubtful, as I said before, whether we should continue to use the general term art at all for such singularity effects. Now, I haven't forgotten that I promised to draw some analogies and indeed relationships between this new kind of art and other contemporary practices, such as some new kind of postmodern economics. But I can't resist inserting here a different kind of example of the postmodern aesthetic event. It will be brief, as the portions are in any case so small. I refer to postmodern cuisine, as it's exemplified in Ferran Adria's now famous restaurant El Bulli. It's gone now, he's closed it. In what are sometimes called, I don't think he likes the word, molecular cooking. The 35 courses that make up a meal at El Bulli are all unfamiliar looking, or if they look familiar to you, you're in for a shock when you taste them. They're no longer natural objects, or perhaps I should say they're no longer realistic objects. Rather, the abstractions of the natural, the taste of asparagus, for example, or of eggplant or persimmon, has been separated from the body of its natural container and incarnated in a new texture and form. And not only the famous foam, whose heyday at El Bulli goes back to an earlier period, I believe, but little caviar shapes, melon balls, sauces, liquids, sponges, folds, and the like. Meanwhile, the new form is important in and of itself, and each new item is recorded and registered, not only by a written and computerized recipe, but I think they're rarely cooked again after this one season, but also then by photography. So it's the image that's preserved, and you consume the image along with the idea, and indeed you consume the conjuncture of elements in what is, just like postmodern art itself, a unique event. The older foods, whether in the realism of classical cuisine or the modernism of the nouvelle variety, were still classified under the great universals of seafood, meat, vegetables, spices, and the like. These astronaut snacks of El Bulli, as they've been called, have radically escaped the domination of the universal, the general, and its naming system. They are, in other words, singular in all the heightened significance postmodern philosophy has given to that term, and which we will eventually confront. Now, in all of this, I haven't lost sight of my own starting point, which was actually not aesthetic, but economic, and indeed turned on that peculiar form of the singularity, which is called the derivative. The postmodern text, to use a more neutral term than work, the postmodern artistic singularity effect, if you prefer, is of the same unique type as that unique one-time financial instrument called the derivative, such as what I want to argue tonight. Both are, at least in part, the result of the situation of globalization, in which multiple determinants in constant transformations at different rates of speed henceforth make any stable structure problematic, unless it's simply a pastiche of the forms of the past. The world financial market is mirrored in the world art market, thrown open by the end of modernism and of its Eurocentric canon of masterworks, along with the implicit or explicit teleology that informed it. Now, to be sure, anything and everything is possible, but only on condition it embrace ephemerality and consent to exist but for a brief time as an event rather than as a durable structure. And I think the rotting away of the shark in Damien Hirst's famous thing is a kind of allegory of this process. No description of the postmodern can omit the centrality of the postmodern economy, which can succinctly be characterized as the dominance of finance capital over old-fashioned production. Now, I follow Giovanni Arrighi in seeing the emergence of a stage of finance capital as a cyclical development in capitalism. As Fernand Braudel famously put it, it was the starting point for Origi's work. Reaching the stage of financial expansion, every capitalist development, in some sense, announces its maturity. Finance capital, Braudel said, is a sign of autumn. Origi's three cyclical stages can be described as an implantation of capitalism, a stage of production and development, finally a stage of saturation and financial speculation, after which capitalism moves on to French territory, to fresh territory, jumping from Genoa, it didn't go to France really, Genoa, Spain, the Netherlands, the Low Countries, England, the United States, and in his book he was thinking of Japan, but later on he discovered that it was to China that it was all really moving. So any satisfactory account of postmodernity would require us to read a proper description of finance capital onto the record, which we can't do right now. But I want to limit myself to this single illustration of the process, albeit a very significant one indeed, and that is the strange and unique mutation of traditional insurance and investment into what's called the derivative. It's not possible to project a concept of the derivative. A general concept is general, remember, and universal. It's not possible to project a concept of the derivative for reasons that will shortly emerge. Any example of the derivative will thus be non-exemplary and different from any other one, and yet perhaps a very oversimplified model from a fine book by Lepuma and Lee on the subject can give a sense of it, along with its indissoluble relationship to globalization. So this is what they imagine, Lepuma and Lee, in this little book. They imagine a United States corporation contracting to provide 10 million cellular phones to a Brazilian subsidiary of a South African corporation. The interior architecture of the cell phone will be produced by a German-Italian corporation, its casings by a Mexican manufacturer, and a Japanese firm will also provide other components. So here we have at least 6 different currencies, and their exchange rates are in perpetual flux, as is the standard norm in globalization today. So the relationship of each of these exchange rates to the others has to be guaranteed by a kind of insurance. That makes many different insurance contracts, maybe 6 or 7, I think more. And it's this entire package of distinct insurance contracts which will make up that financial instrument, which is this unique derivative in question. Obviously, the situation and the instrument will always, in reality, be far more complicated than this. But what's clear is that even taking the old-fashioned futures market on crops, for example, as a kind of simplified and primitive ancestor, there will never be another derivative quite like this one in its structure and requirements. Each one is unique. In fact, it's more like a unique event than it is a contract, something with a stable structure and a juridical status. Meanwhile, as these authorities point out, it only can be inspected, the derivative, and analyzed after the fact, such that for knowledge, this event exists only in the past. The authors conclude pessimistically that there can never be genuine regulation of a transaction since each one is radically different. In other words, there can really be no laws to moderate the dynamics of this kind of instrument, which no less an authority than Warren Buffett has called the financial equivalent of the nuclear bomb. Now, the objection may be raised that there's a contradiction between my cultural analysis of the time of the postmodern, a world without a future, and my use of the example of the derivative, which itself very precisely descends from the old-fashioned futures markets themselves, which were and remain permanently bids on future prices, and thus on the future as such. In other words, I've been arguing here and elsewhere for a kind of contemporary imprisonment in the present, a reduction to the body, if you like, an existential but also a collective loss of historicity in such a way that the future fades away as unthinkable or unimaginable, while the past itself turns into dusty images and Hollywood-type pictures of actors in wigs and the like. Clearly, this is a political diagnosis as well as an existential or phenomenological one, since it's intended to indict our current political paralysis and inability to change, let alone to organize the future and future change. Yet my illustration or symbol or allegory for all this is the derivative, which, as I say, in fact, is a descendant of these old future markets, which were essentially bets on the future of meat and cotton and grain. So even though derivatives may be more complex in the sense that they seem to be bets on bets rather than on real harvests, do they not contain a dimension of futurity which refutes the phenomenological description of postmodern temporality I've diagnosed? In fact, the economic analysis of derivatives analyses, I should say, have themselves insisted on the way in which in each present of time, the derivative redefines value and, as it were, remakes the world in its own image every instant. But that may be too complicated an argument to recapitulate here. But we can certainly ask ourselves what genuine futurity, what a genuine sense of history, what historicity is in the first place. Common sense, whether on the dynastic or the familial level, grasps futurity in terms of the generations. And there certainly seems to be a return to some strong sense of the radical break between the generations in current politics and social life. And this was indeed Heidegger's view of history in Sein und Zeit, the generational one. I've also argued that daily life today thinks in terms of a kind of bracketed dystopia. The old sense of progress is gone, and nothing but disaster in nature as well as society is on the horizon, but not right now. For the businessmen, whose short-term temporality is organized around categories of success and failure, the future is a kind of narrative one, offering multiple scenarios, as they call them, multiple possible outcomes, which, as in war games, must each one be played through and planned for with alternate fallback escape routes. I myself feel that for the moment, in our current situation, a genuine sense of history can only be reawakened by some presiding vision of a utopia which lies beyond the horizon of our current realities and which permits the operation of a kind of dual strategy, if you like, one for the present crisis and one for the organization of the future. But in a way that brings us to our next topic, in many ways our central one, this future, for is this dual strategy not yet another attempt to coordinate the universal and the singular? And have not our philosophers, at least the political ones, been trying to invent that strange and inconceivable beast, conceptual centaur, unicorn, which is the universal singular? At any rate, it is the very notion of singularity as such, which is today at the center of all the concerns I've developed here, a concept quite different from possibility, potentiality, virtuality, or even actuality, and which seems to me to have four quite different and even antagonistic meanings. The first one is philosophical and indeed derives from the old nominalism debates in the Middle Ages, in which singularity is opposed to particularity. The latter is an individual item which one can nonetheless subsume under a general idea or category. That's particularity. And in that sense, the particular always goes hand in hand with the general. Singularity, however, proposes something unique which resists the general and universalizing, let alone totalizing. In that sense, it can have no content as an idea and is merely a designation for what resists all subsumption. It is the existentialist perpetual cry against system, and the anarchist's fierce resistance to the state. I argue that in whatever form, singularity is one of the dominant value categories of postmodernity, and that paradoxically, or perhaps even dialectically, in a spatial age, singularity has become an event or a form of temporality. Then there is no doubt, that's the first meaning of this word, I think. Then there is no doubt the scientific use of the word, where it doesn't seem clear to me whether singularity means something beyond physical law as we know it, or something anomalous, which has not yet been explained by scientists, but which will eventually fall back under an enlarged scientific law of some kind yet to be theorized. What is useful here is then the notion of a singularity event, like a black hole, which, as in the financial dynamics of derivatives we've just outlined, lies on the border between an unrepeatable event in time of some sort and a unique structure which may come together just once, but which is nonetheless a structure of some kind and thereby susceptible to structural analysis, that is to say, to something universal or general. Now, in science fiction, this is the third meaning. In science fiction, this clearly becomes the dominant ambiguity, but rather than with the black holes and subatomic peculiarities of the physicists, it's linked to computers and artificial intelligence. Here, the singularity is projected as a leap or evolutionary mutation of some sort, something that can be dystopian or utopian according to the context. Dystopian singularity would be the emergence of a mechanical species that transcends the human in its intelligence and malignity, as in the Terminator series or Battlestar Galactica. Utopian would then be the emergence of the post-human in the hitherto human species, a kind of mutation of the human and a new hybrid or android type of superhuman intelligence within our own human nature. Ray Kurzweil has become famous for his prediction of a very specific singularity, namely the date at which, as in Terminator, artificial intelligence will catch up with human agency and pass it by, and will enter a whole new era whose heroic struggles have been recorded in those films and TV series I've mentioned. This kind of singularity is the very epitome of a return of the repressed, of a future we're no longer able to imagine, but which insists on marking its imminence with nightmarish anxiety. So this science fiction notion of singularity is itself a sign of the absence of historicity I've been evoking here. On the other hand, an astute colleague points out to me that the derivatives of which we've spoken, which we've called symptoms, would not themselves have been possible before advanced computers made their operations too complex for the individual human mind possible. So perhaps the spike, the takeover, or the singularity has already happened and we just don't know it. The fourth use of the term is philosophical in another sense. It takes us back to medieval philosophy and its debates on nominalism and on universals. As I've said, those issues are still very much alive today, as Adorno's insistence on the creeping nominalism of today's capitalism testifies. But as I've so insistently taken postmodern philosophy as yet another symptom of postmodernity, along with art, food, derivatives, and so forth, it seems best to move directly to the social struggles of which postmodern philosophy is so often the expression and the vehicle, in which the struggle against universals inherent in the very concept of singularity is revealed to be a struggle against hegemonic norms and institutional values as such. Universals are felt to be normative and thereby oppressive and exclusionary, particularly when it comes to minorities. If you posit universals and thereby a universal human nature, in other words, you're already affirming a norm from which all deviations, whether collective or individual, can be denounced and condemned. And to denounce such norms becomes a burning political issue, as in identity politics, and the politics of secessionist groups and marginal or oppressed cultures. For at their outside limit, the hegemonic or oppressive norm can reach genocide and the ideals of ethnic cleansing. While we can also witness it in a more positive form everywhere as a reaction against standardization, against the deterioration, against imperialism, and against the deterioration of national autonomies under globalization. Yet even this seemingly legitimate resistance to oppressive norms and universals remains dialectically ambivalent. The most dramatic examples are to be found in the areas of feminism and gender preference, for to assert universal rights for women is also necessarily to challenge cultures in which another status of women is prescribed. The doctrine of universal human rights is still a doctrine of universals. Yet the repudiation of such universals is equally contradictory, for just as individual cultures can challenge the universal norm of an ascribed human nature, nowadays it's generally an American one, so also women can challenge the universalizing norm inherent in this or that cultural custom or law. Now we have very little time to deal with what are perhaps our most important topics, the transformations of subjectivity and lived experience in the postmodern, and the transformation of politics. As for subjectivity itself and personal experience, I've already mentioned a kind of displacement from the experience of time in the postmodern, from the experience of time to that of space. But surely the center of our subjective experience, our phenomenological or existential experience, has to remain temporal. We would then in that case need to see what temporality feels like under the regime of space. And I think this involves something more drastic than the older Bergsonian critique of spatial experience in terms of some deep time of the élan vital. I think it could be argued that all the fascination of modernism with deep time, not only in Bergson but also in Thomas Mann or Proust, that such fascination derived from the unevenness of the modernizing world, the coexistence of slower village or rural temporalities with the dizzying rapidity of the big cities and of industrialization. But modernism is in that sense the expression of incomplete modernization. And we can draw the conclusion that the postmodern is what we get when modernization is complete, when the countryside is abolished, that is to say, when the peasantry have become wage workers and the older agriculture has been transformed into agribusiness. Now, in this more complete modernization, even the difference between industrial labor and the life of the city bourgeoisie is effaced. Everyone is middle class. Everyone has become a consumer. Everyone is unemployed. Everything has become a shopping mall. Space has become an infinite extension of surfaces which are images, and difference, a temporal phenomenon, as Derrida insisted, has given way to identity and standardization. You will observe that this is still only true in a few privileged spaces and countries in the world, but that makes my point, namely that what constituted uneven development locally and nationally has now been projected out onto a global scale, culture itself becoming a space of uneven development. The connection to globalization is now clear. This sense of global or world scale could not have been possible in the modern period, the period of imperialism, of metropolises and colonies. It could only have become possible after decolonization. In the present context, we must also speak of business rather than national liberation. It's not even of immense new multinational corporations, vastly beyond anything Lenin had in mind by monopoly in the older modernist period. We must speak of the communications technologies that make these gigantic business transnationals possible, and this is a topic which leads in many directions. McLuhan would certainly have identified the computer and the internet with fundamental modifications of subjectivity, and he would have been right. The cultural specialists in media technology would then have their own word to speak on its transformation of the body and the phenomenology of the object world. It seems to me no accident that cultural theory today, cultural studies, has been so radically transformed by the technological perspectives of the new media. We've already underscored the significance of finance capital in this connection. However, it remains to stress the way in which in computerization, spatial distance is now translated into a virtual temporal simultaneity, and in which here too, in other words, space abolishes time. Investments, speculation, the selling off of whole national currencies, divestments and acquisitions, the commodification of a future you can buy and sell. The newer communications technologies have accelerated these processes to the point where the passage of time, Bergsonian durée, has been virtually eliminated. As can be imagined, such an eclipse of time passing seriously modifies human experience if it does not gravely amputate it. In the 20th century, the filmmaker Ken Russell predicted that in the 21st century, standard feature films would run no longer than 15 minutes. And in a sense, he was right, and popular culture gives us many hints about this phenomenon, whose equivalent is the disappearance of plot. Action films today really have no plot. The latter is a pretext for explosive events that fill up minute after minute the present of the viewing. I call this the end of temporality, the reduction to the body and the present. What's sought for is an intensity of the present. The before and after tends to disappear. And clearly enough, this is something that happens to our sense of history as well. No previous societies have had as little functional memory, as little sense of the historical past as this one. And clearly the disappearance of the past entails the disappearance of the future as well in the long term. Nobody believes in long-term societal change any longer. Our present is hemmed in by an evaluation of the past as either failed or successful modernization, and by a conception of the future as impending natural and ecological disaster. Such are only some of the consequences of a primacy of space over time in postmodernity. All of this has much to do with the transformation of the individual subject today, and I think finally at the stirrings of this kind of postmodernity, this is why the structuralists and post-structuralists spoke of the death of the subject, by which we meant, and they meant in less melodramatic language, the increasing fragility and vulnerability of the older bourgeois individualism, its deterioration under conditions of large-scale institutions, and the decline of that capitalist competition which brought individualism into being in the first place as an acquisitive and aggressive ego and a powerful and Oedipal identity. All the features I've attributed to some properly postmodern subjectivity are to be understood in terms of that process. The reduction to the present, the body as some last reality to survive the exhaustion of bourgeois culture, the mutability and changeability, variability of mood replacing the self-confident stances of an older emotional system. How much the more so then will not subjectivity be transformed when open to the vicissitudes of that even vaster landscape which is globalization itself? No longer protected by family or region, or even by the nation itself and national identity, the emergence of the vulnerable subject into a world of billions of anonymous equals is bound to bring about some still more momentous changes in human reality. In hindsight, we can look at globalization, or this third stage of capitalism, as the other side or face of that immense movement of decolonization and liberation which took place all over the world in the 1960s. The first two stages of capitalism, the period of national industries and markets, followed by that of imperialism and the acquisition of colonies, the development of some properly colonial world economy, these first two moments were characterized by the construction of otherness on a world scale. First, the various nation states organized their populations into competing national groups who could only feel their identities by way of xenophobia and the hatred of the national enemies, who could only define their identity by an opposition to their opposite numbers. But these nationalisms quickly enough took on non-national forms, as particularly in Europe, but in lots of places. Various minorities and other language speakers evolved their own national projects. Then, in that gradual enlargement, which is not to be confused with a later globalization, the systems of imperialism began to colonize the world in terms of the otherness of their colonized subjects. Racial otherness and a Eurocentric or Americanocentric contempt for so-called underdeveloped or weak or subaltern cultures partitioned so-called modern people from those who were still pre-modern and separated advanced or ruling cultures from the dominated. With this moment of imperialism, modernity, the second stage of capitalism, a worldwide system of otherness is then established. It will be clear then that with decolonization, all that is gradually swept away. Those subaltern others who couldn't speak for themselves, let alone rule themselves, now for the first time, as Jean-Paul Sartre famously put it, speak in their own voice and claim their own existential freedom. Now suddenly the bourgeois subject is reduced to equality with all those former others, and a new kind of anonymity reigns throughout world society as a whole. Billions of real people now exist, and not just the millions of your own nation or your own language. Now, what does all this have to do with politics? I'll conclude with a few remarks on the political in postmodernity, remarks which are descriptive and don't pretend to offer any solutions, even my own personal opinions and positions on the subject. But since we were talking about space, I'll put a very simple proposition to you, namely that today all politics is about real estate. Postmodern politics is essentially a matter of land grabs on a local as well as a global scale. Whether you think of the question of Palestine, the settlements and the camps, or of the politics of raw materials and extractions, whether you think of ecology, the rainforests, for example, or the problems of federalism, citizenship, and immigration, or whether it's a question of gentrification in the great cities, as well as bidonville, favelas, and townships, and of course the movement of the landless. Today, everything is about land. In Marxist terms, all these struggles result from the commodification of land and the dissolution of the last remnants of feudalism and its peasantries, their replacement by industrial agriculture or agribusiness and farm workers. Now, where is time in all this? Is to be found in the new flash crowds enabled by cell phones and texting, the new mass demonstrations of Seattle and Tiananmen, of Eastern Europe, of Tahrir Square, and of Wisconsin, and of course of Occupy. These truly mark the emergence of what my friends Michael Hart and Tony Negri call multitude, but they're no longer the politics of duration. They're the politics of the instant, of the present, of what Negri himself has called constitutive power, as opposed to constituted power. Postmodernity in general is characterized by this new kind of present time, a reduction to the present, a reduction to the body. In this new dialectic of omnipresent space and the temporal present, history, historicity, the sense of history, is the loser. The past is gone. We can no longer imagine the future. It's clear that this waning of history confronts those of us still committed to radical systemic change with some very real political problems, and perhaps that's the moment to break off this survey. Thank you. you think people want to ask some questions?
Thank you very much for the panorama of this talk. There's some 4 minutes left for discussion, so if you have questions or if there's something you always wanted to say to Fredric Jameson, this is your chance now. So please, I'd like some voices. And does the mic work? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. This is certainly not something that I've always wanted to say, because it's a surprise to see that there's an old friend coming back, time. Time, of course, which was, the central hallmark of the modernist regime in a way. From the experience of historical time just down to the experience of individual interiority, right? And so, in a way, modernism was over just when time basically was discovered as some kind of ideological construction and was kind of dissolved in the new mechanisms of structure and so forth. So now you're telling us that time is back in this new guise of immanence, of immanent singularity, without any historicist moorings anymore, which is no longer experienced in this grander socio-historical context. So I'm wondering if this diagnosis is correct, is there still something like structure in this postmodern temporal moment, right? In this postmodernist experience of singular time, can there still be something to be very blunt, class, experience of social historical constraints acting on our everyday life? And so if there's nothing left of that, is there still anything like dialectics? Because if
anything
we're
like
left with singularity as the only possible mode of temporality, there is no dialectics anymore, isn't it?
There's no
Dialectics. Dialectics.
Well, no. I think one has to think in terms of a spatial dialectics. Henri Lefebvre talked about this in his book on space, which is the groundbreaking work, and I've tried to make a few speculations in some stuff of mine. But the point is that what I'm trying to say is that this experience of time is a novel one, and it can't be exhausted, I think, by the famous older descriptions of temporality that you have in Aristotle, St. Augustine, and so forth, or in the older religious traditions. That it would be important to continue to work on a kind of phenomenology of this new, of this phenomenon, which is new, and to see what its possibilities are. Now, you say there's nothing like structure. Well, but these constellations, we've been talking about constellations, whether it's in economics, or in art, or in exhibits, constellations are structures, but they're momentary structures, and they dissolve and make way for others. I think the same can be said, obviously, of these great political moments I've mentioned. Those are constellations, and are they? Do they have long-term effects? I think that remains to be seen. These are very fragile moments, I think, very exhilarating, but do they not, when the event itself with a capital E is over, does not then some more routine kind of system flow back over them and reconstitute itself? For the labor movement, we're at the beginning of what Marx anticipated as the world market, when everything is commodified. We can glimpse it. I think it really couldn't be glimpsed before, but it's not yet complete. And I think that labor remains the only force that really can institute systemic change in this system. But labor on a world scale has yet to reorganize itself. And so the labor movements have generally remained national, and in the kind of production we have been gradually weakened. Now, you talk about disappearance of class. Well, the great political and rhetorical event in recent American politics is this slogan of the 1% versus the 99%. That's the original form, I think, of class consciousness, them versus us. And it seems to me that whether we're talking about classical labor, we're not talking about classical labor situations, but there is increasing class separation of that kind. So I think all those things are there in new forms. We just haven't always been able to identify those forms. It seems to me this question of a postmodern temporality is one way to go about that.
Well, just a small addendum to just explanation on it's actually the robots that have united, and not the workers. The workers are being particularized into smaller and smaller units, and they're becoming more and more helpless against the whole system.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that we see examples of immense agency and activity in some of these moments of change. But on the other hand, I think people have never felt quite so helpless in the face of whatever impending future there is as they do today, wherever they live. I mean, whether it's in Africa or in advanced countries in Europe. So that's something that, because we don't have the means to affect anything, and this is why the whole representational system of politics is as frustrating today as it seemed revolutionary in another system. I think the scale of this whole thing, the demographics of human life today seem to be absolutely overwhelming, and there's individuals conceive of agency in individual terms, and we can't imagine that. I don't think the robots have quite taken over yet, but that's the science fictional spike.
Workers of the world unite. That was my illusion. The Marxist workers of the world unite, and that has been reversed into robots of the world uniting against the workers. That's how I should have.
Yes. Well, I think those are the nightmares that represent a kind of way of thinking about the future today, and I think that kind of dystopian vision seems to be one of the few ways of thinking about history and the future that remain available to people in this situation. That's why these works are so intense for their readers.
Hi. I have two questions. The first one is on the importance of style for your work. Style. Right from your early work on Sartre until your recent work in postmodernism, style has been a constant, recurrent theme. I'm not interested necessarily in your own style, but in the concept of style, especially in the Sartrean problematic and Barthes' writings. And more specifically, the importance of style for your theory of postmodernism, as postmodernism is arising out of the tension between Barthes' individualist conception of style and a more collective notion of a period style. And the second question relates to the status of theory in postmodernity. And here I'd like to suggest a certain thesis about your own work and the status of theory. And that's that if, for Lukács, the novel was the epic in a world abandoned by God, in the sense that it aspires to a totality that's no longer organically possible, would it be a potential argument that theory, especially in the form in which you practice it, has replaced the novel as the epic of postmodernity, in the sense that it aspires to that same sort of this time a self-conscious totality, as the next stage in a dialectical progression?
Well, for that, it's very ingenious and interesting. But where would be the narrative of it? Maybe theory tells stories, yes. So I think it's more a question of making connections. That is, the whole point of theory, and of Marxist theory certainly is to make connections. And generally what's left out is economics, and so Marxism has been understood as being an economic theory. But it really means connecting up all these other things, personal things, cultural stuff, and so forth, with the economic. And I think theory has a commitment to that relationality, and in that sense, it's no longer a system. It also maybe is a kind of perpetual present. Of course, it's as commodified as everything else anyway. I don't know, but I suppose, I think you'd have to look at the non-fictional. There's a moment in Dr. Faustus of Thomas Mann, a book I hope all of you know, in which the devil says to Adrian, you don't understand that our people today don't want the fictive anymore. They don't want fiction. They want the real and so forth. And I think something can be said for the idea that the notion of the fictive and of made-up stories and so on is more and more, is less and less tempting in the face of narratives of the real and so forth. So one would have to look at the weakness of the novel in that sense and see what kinds of tastes people this weakening of fiction has led to. Now, your first question about style is very interesting. Yeah, Barth is for me central. For his first little book, The Zero Degree of Writing. And I understood him to say, before capitalism, there was rhetoric. And the classical literatures, and of course in French, that means the 17th century, it doesn't mean the Greeks, but all the way back, were based on rhetoric and on fixed form and on non-personal systems of harmony and so forth. It's with the emergence of a middle-class age or a bourgeois age or whatever you want to call it, revolutionary age, that suddenly this desire to project your personality into the very languages of works and so forth it becomes irrepressible. I think it was an Austrian critic, Ernst Fischer, who said, the artists in the Romantic period, with the disappearance of feudalism, the patrons also disappeared. And so in a market economy, the artists also now had to sell things. And so what he said, what they came to sell, he said, was their own soul. Byron becomes the first great example, worldwide example of the artist who invents a soul to sell you, which is something much more precious than anything you have. And that's the same as the emergence of style. And I sort of think it's when style begins to disappear. Barth's theory of, I don't know if people follow this anymore, but his theory of white writing, bleached writing, if you like, writing without style, I think is untenable. It was a pious hope for really a non-political, non-engaged literature. He was still Sartrean then, but I think with reservations. So I don't think what succeeds modernity is white writing. It's the end of style and the emergence of something else. When I was talking about decolonization here, I talked about anonymity. I mean that in a good sense. That is, it's the getting rid of the ego and so forth. This is now the passage is one from style to anonymity, maybe. And I think it's in those terms, and also in terms of constellations, networks, and so on, of forms that transcend the individual, but not in any utopian way, understand. We're not yet putting together genuine new communities to replace these older ethnic or national or language ones. So this is still a sort of styleless collectivity. But I think it's right what you say about it.
I would just like to ask, in your argument about the end of temporality, how do you accommodate the flurry of remembering which we can witness everywhere? I mean, commemoration is sort of a major trait in many places, and I personally have done a larger research project on the independence jubilees in Africa. Independence jubilees in Africa on 50 years of independence. And that was very much reinterpreting the past and looking at the future. So people were very intensely debating of what lessons to be drawn from the past and what to do in the future. And I somehow cannot fit that empirical finding very well with the end of temporality hypothesis.
Oh, I think it's absolutely consistent with it. The past is slipping away, and so you have to invent these new forms to try to remind yourself of that, to mark it, to make it into an object, to hang on to it somehow. I mean, I think the African sense of the future was far stronger in the decolonization period than it is now. I mean, there really was a utopian future to be made after Ghana and so forth. And but once that future is not part of your own existential experience, you've got to make it up. I think the museum today is an example of that. All these monument things are also an example of that. It's a little like what I forgot to say to Johannes, namely that time becomes a philosophical issue when it starts to disintegrate. So once you're left with only the present, then you've got to start thinking what time was and how is it to be analyzed and how can one live temporality like this. I think this resurfacing, quite right, as you say, of desperate forms of memory politics is absolutely consistent. I don't think that the 19th century, they had their various commemorations, but they didn't have to, it was still alive for them in various degrees. Lukács said, well, it was Fontana, I think, who said this. Lukács quotes it. He says, you can't write a good historical novel set back before the life of your own grandparents. And I think he was thinking there of still larger families, where you hear the grandparents talking about the past. It doesn't have to be true what they say, but it just proves that there was something living was going on in that past. And so the novelist can go to that and recreate some form of historical vision that really doesn't have to correspond to anything, but that has an authenticity. Once you go back further, Flaubert, going back to Carthage, for example, then it's all made up. It's all silent movies or costume dramas and so on. Now, our question is, now that we don't have the extended families and the old people are all in the homes and so forth, what historical novels are we supposed to write? So the very fact of the historical novel becomes an interesting philosophical problem today. But I don't think there's a contradiction between what you're observing and what I said.
I have a question about the ending of your talk, and this actually is something that I've always wanted to ask you. Is that, where's the solution? That is, if this diagnosis of the ephemeral and the singularity is something that we're trying to counter, where would the solution be? And would it be a universalism purged of the havoc it has caused?
I think if there's to be a new universalism, it has to happen before intellectuals become aware of it. That is, I don't think we can make these things up. But I mean, I think there's a whole set of new signs. I think myself, the Occupy movement in the United States is a really interesting matter, a very powerful matter that's displaced all this Tea Party stuff. But I think it's not up to us to put forward these things, but rather to think about the problems. I also think it's very important. Another way of thinking about this, you know, radical politics today, since how long? I don't know, tends to be, in the literal sense of the word, conservative. I think Benjamin may have started this when he said the revolution is not the train racing forward. It's pulling the emergency brake on the train, which is capitalism. And I think that expresses very well the idea, which all of us have in one way or another, that this is, all these changes are happening so fast that seems like a train that's out of order, and gradually things are being completely destroyed and modified without anybody's possibility of doing it. And therefore that we have to hold on to the past. And that our image of revolutionary change is reinventing the past in some way. This was not at all Marx's point of view. Marx was very excited by inventions, by discoveries, by all the scientific progress that was being made in his own time. He was very fascinated with all of these new things that were happening in the 1870s and 1860s and 70s and so forth. And his conception of another society was one of absolute technological progress and so forth. And it seems to me that today, where no one can be sure whether computers are really our enemy or not, or whether computers embody some new form of politics and communication that takes us out of the older things. It seems to me that we have to, if we're interested in radical change, we have to pursue technological change more radically rather than less. And attempt to get ourselves out of the habit of thinking about pulling the emergency brake on history. If something new is to happen, besides catastrophe, it has to happen on the basis of what's going on now. But I think there are things happening now, and we have to be aware of some of them, or maybe even participate in.
Follow-up question on your relation, or your theory's relation actually, with Hart and Acri. You refer to them as your friends, right? And theoretically, obviously, there's a lot that you share with them. But I would be interested in how you respond to their claim that the subjectivity that you see beyond the horizon has already begun to assert itself in the present moment, right? They seem to be much more optimistic about change than at least what you presented in your talk now. So would it make sense to place you in these two categories, that you're more following the Adorno ideology critique, whereas they see really the utopian moment in the present with Bloch pretty much? So again, what's the exact relationship between these theories then?
Well, I think these are immense works that we can't discuss in detail. I think the whole notion, the whole attempt to invent a category like multitude, as opposed to people, crowd, class even, in the sense that class was sort of factory-based. I think that's a very interesting attempt and a very interesting lesson, provided one understands that there isn't any word for collectivity, there isn't any concept for collective action. And the multitude is therefore a way of righting the balance and trying to draw our attention to forms of collectivity that were not covered, singular forms of collectivity, let's say, that were not covered by by the older words. So there, I think we have a conceptual, a terminological shift to evaluate. Now, the real question is, I think, for everybody on the left, from a theoretical point of view, is the famous question of immaterial labor. And I don't think we can go into that now, but their idea is that, theoretical idea is that this is an emergence from the general intellect notion of Marx and the Grundrisse, and that labor is, that all of this communicational stuff is immaterial. That much I think one can accept. But on the other hand, what you describe, although I think there are many problems with it, but what you describe in a way is exactly Marx's idea that if there is to be a new form of life, it must be happening all around us right now. And it has to be disengaged from the things that limit it. And I take their perspective, which is very much an Italian perspective, I think, as an attempt to show that in this late capitalism, a lot is going on, which could be the harbinger of a very different future than the one we see. So it's a utopian emphasis. I think that they are as confused as the rest of us when it comes to asking what multitude does after it expresses itself. I mean, once you've had one of these great collective moments, then what happens? And so then the question becomes that of party and organization and so on. And you perhaps know Tony Negri's history and his anti-communism in the sense of the old communist parties, and how that inflects his picture of things. But I think it does not reflect sufficient. I think one needs some greater meditation on the matter of organization, of collectivity, and so forth. It's the problem of once you have an outburst and an expression of energies, then are they to be turned into a thing? Are they to be made over into a state? And are all states always bad? And are they always reflective of power? I think that is one of the dominant political questions in postmodern political thinking, and it's certainly present in theirs.
Well, just a mildly positive flash into the future. The accumulation of capital has taken unforeseen turns of late, in that great industrialist tycoons now turn their accumulated capital, billions of dollars, for they socialize it, they turn it into foundations. I mean, I'm speaking of Mr. Buffett and Mr. Gates, and there are lots of others. I mean, this is becoming a minor trend now, so such developments have happened too, and that was unforeseen by Marx, by the way. Who would have thought it accumulates with a bust, and then you have the world revolution.
I don't think it was alien to Marx. After all, you look at the 19th century, it is the age of philanthropy. That's exactly what we're talking about. When people whom Marx admired, like Robert Owen or Dickens or people like that, could only think of, I don't mean Owen, so Dickens would be a much better example, that the system could only be modified by this kind of philanthropy, which is, one doesn't want to indict it in terms of guilt and so on, but obviously that's a part of this. I think of two other things. First, people are developing a theory today of that one of the major forms of capital accumulation today in globalization or postmodernity, whatever you want to call it, is really a return to ground rent. These people are clipping their coupons in a sense. This is no longer the kind of growth of capital that happened in a productive industrial period. I think that's a very interesting idea, once again an Italian idea, because I think the most interesting economists today are mostly Italian, coming out of the whole operaismo movement and so forth. But that means that capital itself is regressing. The other thing I would say, I hope it doesn't sound too terrible, but I'll say it anyway. Hegel said a terrible thing, namely, wars are the health of nations. I don't think by that he meant blood so much and killing. I think he meant the destruction of capital. What's healthy about a war is the destruction of all this excess capital. And it's this excess of capital that is really our problem ultimately, I think. So I think you're quite right to bring that up. Well, you could have a depression, sure, but that would be the financial equivalent of war.
Are there any more questions? If not, I'd like to pose the last one down there. I've been trained in science study, which is a rather reflexive business, and please excuse this question. Following Marx, you construct an explanatory relationship between economics, politics, and culture. Well, do you have a good explanation how the cultural production of Fredric Jameson was possible in the times of late financial capitalism? You have a slight idea of how your own work had been possible.
Well, I think at least some of it comes from the fact that I was not formed in American traditions. My field of study was French. France at that time was a very political place. It still is in a way, but maybe not in the same way. And so that's one influence on me that has allowed me to break out of, I think, rather constricted American stereotypes. And of course, Germany, German philosophy, and so on was another one. So I think, I don't want to say that I was prematurely globalized, but at any rate, then there's a third thing, I think, that you always have to take into consideration. It's action at distance. Sartre talks about that when he talks about the relationship of intellectuals to labor. He says, we didn't know anything about workers, but we felt them out there. And they exercised on us an action at distance in the physical sense, I guess. And for the rest of us, the existence of certain places in socialism, certainly the Cuban Revolution was very important to me and still is, of other revolutionary movements, and even the Soviet 60s, I think, and Khrushchev and so forth, the thaw. All of this made a certain kind of thinking possible that maybe wasn't possible before, maybe other thinking was possible then, and wasn't really possible after. So that's this way in which events that take place in other spaces can impact your own national thinking, or your own thinking within a national situation. I think that's very important too.
Thank you very much, Fredric Jameson, for coming. Thanks you for joining us.